They say a photograph steals a fragment of the soul. If that's true, then the last known image of the Wright family is all that remains of theirs. It's a black and white print. Now the original colors faded and warped over the years. The glossy surface cracked like dry earth. But even through time's decay, the moment it captured feels alive. The July sun is bright, the air heavy with heat. The Wrights' backyard stretches behind them in a blur of uncut grass, the kind that whispers when the wind runs through it. David Wright stands tall at the grill, his sleeves rolled up, a spatula in hand. The faint curl of smoke drifts upward, frozen midair. Eleanor sits at the picnic table, her chin resting on her palm, smiling at someone just outside the frame, a smile that's warm, unguarded, the kind you don't fake for a camera. Their 3 children crowd near her. The eldest daughter clutches a paper plate piled with corn on the cob. The youngest's mouth is mid-laugh, and the middle child squints against the sun, holding a red balloon by its string. And there at the edge of the frame is Jonah. He isn't smiling, he's caught in a half-turn, his gaze aimed toward the woods beyond the fence. His posture is rigid, his jaw set in a photo brimming with light and summer ease. Jonah is a fracture, a darker note beneath the melody. The man who took the picture, a neighbor named Frank Allen, said it was just a casual shot. Head wandered over, beer in hand, after hearing the hiss of the grill and the children's laughter. Frank said the Wrights were always like that in summer. Open yard, open invitation. It was the kind of small-town hospitality Cedar Hollow was known for. What Frank didn't know, then what no one could have known, was that within an hour of pressing that shutter, everyone in the picture would vanish. No struggle, no signs of departure. Plates of food left untouched, drinks sweating in the sun, the grill still burning. When police arrived later that night, the photograph lay face down on the picnic table, as if someone had glanced at it and set it aside. In the first weeks of the investigation, it was barely mentioned, but over time it became the talisman of the case, the last trace of a life, of a summer day, of 5 people and a guest who stepped out of reality and never stepped back. And the copy most people know is the one the papers ran in September of 1977, long after hope had begun to dim. The headline, "BBQ Mystery Stunned Cedar Hollow," is now just another artifact in the town library's brittle archives, but the image never lost its weight. Even now, decades later, it surfaces in late-night forums and cold case documentaries. People zoom in on Jonah's face, speculating about what he saw, what he knew. Some swear they've spotted a faint figure in the shadow of the trees behind him, a trick of light, a flaw in the film. Others say the balloon string in the little boy's hand bends unnaturally, as though caught in a gust of wind that no one else felt. In every retelling, the photograph takes on more meaning than it ever should. To some, it's proof of something sinister, a warning captured in plain sight. To others, it's just a family at a summer barbecue, frozen before tragedy struck, the ordinariness of the moment making what followed all the more impossible. But for the people of Cedar Hollow, that picture is more than evidence. It's a ghost. Ask anyone old enough to remember that summer, and they'll tell you the same thing. It didn't feel like the beginning of anything unusual. It felt like every other July. The days were long, the nights were warm, the town was safe. There was no reason to imagine that this photograph, one click of a camera, would mark the last time the Wright family's names were spoken without grief attached. Now, 48 years later, the photograph is being examined again, because Jonah, the silent man at the edge of the frame, has come back, and with him, he carries a story that no one in Cedar Hollow ever expected to hear. But before we can understand what he's about to say, we have to step back into that afternoon, into the hum of cicadas and the scent of charcoal, into the clink of ice in lemonade glasses, and the way the sun caught in Eleanor's hair. We have to walk through the open gate of the Wright backyard, just as the neighbors did that day, and sit at the table for a moment, not knowing that the air is thick with a kind of silence that doesn't belong to summer at all, the kind of silence that waits and listens, and when the time comes, swallows everything whole. Cedar Hollow wasn't the kind of place that made national news. It sat in the gentle bend of a river, surrounded by cornfields that rolled on for miles until they dissolved into the horizon's haze. The roads in and out were long and straight, the kind that made you check your gas tank twice before driving. From above, the town looked like a scattering of houses stitched together by one main street, with a red brick water tower standing guard over it all. Life here moved to the rhythm of the seasons. Planting, growing, harvest. The slow sleep of winter summers were heavy with heat, the kind that pressed on your skin and made every sound feel louder: the thrum of cicadas, the rattle of screen doors, the laughter of children riding bikes past the old grain silos. In the summer of 1977, Cedar Hollow was exactly as it had always been, or at least that's how people remember it now. Memory has a way of sanding off the edges, leaving the smooth idea of a place rather than its raw truth. But even through nostalgia's blur, certain things remain sharp. The Wright family had moved to town 8 years earlier in '69, just before the birth of their youngest. David Wright was a mechanic, the kind who could fix an engine with one hand while drinking coffee with the other. He kept a small shop on the edge of town where customers brought not just their cars, but their stories. Eleanor taught part-time at the elementary school, her soft voice and steady patience making her the teacher every child hoped to get. They weren't wealthy, but they were comfortable. Their 2-story house on Willow Lane had a white-painted porch and a backyard that sloped gently toward the woods. It was the kind of home that hosted birthday parties, block gatherings, and impromptu barbecues like the one that would later become infamous. That July, the days felt endless. Gasoline was cheap, fireworks still lit the night sky without permits, and the town's only radio station played the same 20 songs on a loop. The Wright kids spent most afternoons barefoot, their feet stained green from running through the grass. The family dog, a golden retriever named Penny, lay in the shade of the porch steps, her tail thumping at every familiar voice. Cedar Hollow was a place where doors stayed unlocked and neighbors wandered in without knocking. You knew who would be at the diner every morning and which porch lights would flicker on at dusk. Outsiders didn't just stumble into town, you had to mean to come here, which is why Jonah's presence raised quiet questions from the start. Jonah wasn't from Cedar Hollow. Eleanor introduced him as an old friend, but no one could quite place from where he was. A tall, thin man in his mid-30s with a kind of restlessness in his eyes that didn't match the town's unhurried pace. He had arrived 2 weeks before the barbecue, staying in the spare room above the Wright's garage. The polite thing was not to ask questions, and in Cedar Hollow people were very polite. Still, the whispers found their way into back corners of the diner. Some thought Jonah was passing through after a bad breakup. Others guessed he was looking for work and staying with the Wrights until he found it. But a few, the ones who noticed details, wondered if he was there for something else entirely. One of those details was the way Jonah looked at the woods behind the Wright property. He didn't just glance, he watched as though waiting for something to step out. That summer was warm, but unsettled. In late June, there had been a strange thunderstorm that rattled windows and knocked out power for a full night. The next morning, several people reported an odd humming sound lingering in the air, though no one could trace its source. By early July, the talk had faded, but a subtle tension seemed to thread through the days. It wasn't enough to name, but it was there in the slight pauses between conversations, in the way Penny sometimes growled at nothing visible. If you'd asked anyone, then they'd have said life in Cedar Hollow was peaceful, and in a way it was. Barbecues still filled backyards, the ice cream trucks still rolled down Willow Lane, and kids still stayed out until the streetlights buzzed to life. But that summer had a strange kind of weight to it, like air pressing down before a storm. The Wrights, as always, were in the center of it all. Eleanor's birthday was coming up, and David joked that the barbecue was just an excuse to make her favorite lemon pie. Neighbors were invited, though not all came. A few families were out of town, others busy. In the end, it was smaller than usual, just the Wrights, their children, Penny under the table, and Jonah by the fence. That afternoon was warm but breezy, the kind of day where the smell of charcoal could drift across half the block. Frank Allen, the neighbor who would later take the last photograph, remembered hearing a burst of laughter while he watered his tomato plants. It was the kind of sound you didn't think twice about, a sign that summer was doing what summer should. No one that day could have imagined they were listening to an ending. Even now, decades later, those who lived through that summer describe it with the kind of precision usually reserved for disasters. They remember the angle of the sun, the sticky sweetness of melted ice cream, the hiss of the grill. They remember Penny's bark carrying across the yard and stopping abruptly. They remember Jonah standing very still, as if hearing something no one else could. And they remember the moment when Cedar Hollow's rhythm, steady, predictable, unbroken for generations, stumbled. Because it's one thing for a family to move away without saying goodbye, it's another for them to disappear without leaving a trace in a town where everyone knows the sound of your screen door. By the time the Wrights' absence turned into panic, that summer in Cedar Hollow would already be over. The cicadas would fade, the corn would be harvested, and the Wright house would fall silent. But on that afternoon, in that golden humming warmth, nothing had yet Broken the grill was still smoking, the children were still laughing, and the woods behind the fence were still holding their secrets that would not stay buried forever. The evening began the way all summer evenings should, with the smell of smoke and the sound of voices rising over it. Frank Allen remembers glancing at the clock in his kitchen. It was 5:42 p.m., had been meaning to mow the lawn before dark, but the laughter drifting in from next door made him pause. The Wrights were hosting again, nothing unusual, and he figured he'd stop over for a beer before getting back to work. He didn't know then that the choice to step outside at that exact moment would put him among the last to see them alive. The sun was still bright when Frank walked through the open gate. Penny barked once from under the picnic table before rolling onto her side, tail sweeping the grass. David stood at the grill flipping burgers, the smoke curling into the breeze. Eleanor was slicing a lemon pie, the knife catching the light. Each time it rose, the kids darted in and out of the yard, one chasing the balloon that bobbed against the wind, the other two in a running game only they understood. And then there was Jonah leaning on the fence. He wasn't drinking, wasn't smiling. His gaze flickered between the tree line and the family, like he was keeping watch over both. Frank stayed. Maybe 20 minutes. They talked about nothing, the weather, gas prices, the baseball scores on the radio. AB drifted lazily between the plates, and David swatted it away with a laugh. The air smelled of charred meat and cut grass. At some point, Jonah stepped away from the fence and murmured something to Eleanor. Frank didn't catch it, but he remembers the way her expression faltered just for a second before she smiled again. She touched Jonah's arm lightly, as if to reassure him or herself. By 6:15, Frank decided to head back home. As he reached the gate, he turned for one last look. The grill hissed, the balloon danced in the air. Eleanor leaned over the table. Everything seemed intact, but later Frank would replay that moment over and over and wonder if it had already started. The first sign came at 6:38 p.m. A boy on his bike riding past the Wright property later told police that he saw the youngest Wright child standing in the middle of the yard staring at the woods, not moving, not waving, just staring. The balloon was gone. The boy didn't stop, but he remembered thinking it was odd that no one else was outside. The second sign came minutes later. The porch light flickered. This wasn't unusual in older houses, but the Wright home had been rewired just 2 summers earlier. The neighbor across the street saw it from her kitchen window. She assumed David had flipped the switch, maybe calling the kids inside. What happened between 640 and 655 has never been accounted for. By 7:00 p.m. the yard was silent. When Frank returned, this time with his wife, carrying a plate of brownies, they found the gate still open. The grill was still on low flames, licking at charred patties. The lemon pie sat on the table untouched except for Eleanor's first slice. Plates of food rested in the grass, as if they'd been dropped mid-bite. Penny was gone. There was no sound, not from the woods, not from the house. The air was heavy, unnaturally still, the kind of silence that makes you want to hold your breath. Frank called out. No answer. They stepped cautiously toward the house. The back door was open, the screen swinging lightly on its hinges. Inside, the kitchen light was on. Glasses of lemonade sweated on the counter. A radio played softly from the living room, the voice of the announcer crackling with static, but no one was there. Not in the kitchen, not upstairs, not in the yard. The Wrights had simply gone. The first 911 call was logged at 7:14 p.m. Within minutes, the sheriff's deputy arrived, followed by 2 patrol cars. Officers searched every room, the attic, the basement. They checked for footprint, signs of forced entry, anything that might explain why 6 living beings had evaporated in under 20 minutes. They found nothing. The only anomaly came from a deputy who'd been sent into the woods behind the property. He reported an area of grass pressed flat in a perfect circle about 20 feet across, with no scorch marks, no debris. It was as if something heavy had rested there briefly and then vanished later. The official report would list it simply as unexplained ground disturbance. By 8:30 p.m., the search widened to nearby streets. Neighbors opened their doors to police officers, asking the same questions. Did you see anyone leave the Wright property? Any unusual vehicles? Any loud noises? Almost everyone answered no, except for one. An elderly woman who lived 2 houses down claimed she'd heard a humming sound around 645, low and constant like an electrical transformer. It lasted less than a minute, then stopped abruptly. She assumed it was the power lines acting up. Her statement was taken, filed, and largely forgotten. At 9:10 p.m., the search dogs were brought in. The handlers led them into the Wright yard, giving them items of clothing to scent. The dogs pulled toward the woods, but stopped at the same circle of pressed grass the deputy had found earlier there. They circled, whining before lying down and refusing to move. By nightfall, the search expanded to the riverbank and nearby roads. Flashlights cut through the dark beams, swinging over the long grass, and shallow water. Volunteers joined the hunt, calling the family's names into the night. But the names went unanswered. The Wright house stood open and lit until past midnight, as if expecting its owners to return at any moment. The grill was finally shut off. The pie was wrapped in foil. The photograph, the one Frank had taken earlier that evening, was left face down on the picnic table, as if someone had placed it there in haste. It would be the last ordinary object in a case that would become anything but ordinary. When the official incident log closed at 2:14 a.m., the sheriff's office had no suspects, no motive, and no evidence of foul play. But what they did have, what they could not shake, was the impossible timing. 6 people, 1 backyard, no witnesses to their departure. 20 minutes unaccounted for, and somewhere in that missing slice of time, the Wright family and their guest had crossed an invisible threshold, one that left no trail behind. In the weeks that followed, every detail of that evening would be dissected, magnified, and rearranged into a dozen competing theories. But no matter how it was told, the timeline always led back to the same cliff: 6:40 p.m. laughter and light, and 7 p.m. silence. A silence so complete it felt like the world itself had blinked. The search began with urgency. It ended in disbelief. By dawn, the Wright property was ringed with squad cars. Their red and blue lights spun lazily in the early mist, casting fractured reflections in the dewy grass. Officers moved briskly between the house, the yard, and the woods beyond, their radios cracking with clipped updates. Sheriff Harold Givens, a man who had seen his share of tragedies, stood on the Wright's porch with a styrofoam cup of coffee in hand. His face was drawn not from lack of sleep, but from the creeping realization that something here didn't make sense. Disappearances. He knew how to handle people. Left trails, footprints, tire marks, a witness who saw something, even runaways left signs. But this was like chasing smoke. The first sweep was by the book. The house, all doors unlocked, no signs of forced entry. Upstairs, the beds were neatly made, clothes folded in drawers. A half-finished jigsaw puzzle sat on the dining table. The only thing remotely unusual was the way the back screen door hung open, as if caught mid-motion. The yard, the grill was cooled, now a crusted layer of blackened meat still on the grate. The picnic table was cleared of perishables, but plates and glasses remained sticky with condensation. The family dog, Penny, was nowhere to be found. The woods, less than 30 feet beyond the fence, officers found the same circular depression in the grass noted the night before. No burn marks, no footprints leading away, just flattened vegetation pressed as evenly as if by a heavy unseen hand. By 9 a.m., the county had brought in search and rescue teams. Volunteers lined up shoulder to shoulder, moving through the fields in wide arcs. Others combed the riverbank, poking at tangles of driftwood with sticks. The air was thick with humidity, each breath carrying the metallic taste of the water nearby. A helicopter buzzed overhead, its downdraft bending the tops of the cornstalks. From above, Cedar Hollow looked deceptively peaceful. The neat grid of houses, the glitter of the river, the unbroken green of the woods. But the radio chatter told another story. Negative on the north quadrant, no trace in the south perimeter, nothing on thermal imaging. By midday, search dogs had been rotated in from 2 neighboring counties. They scented personal items: David's work jacket, Eleanor's cardigan, a child's favorite stuffed bear. The dogs pulled toward the woods, noses down, tails rigid, only to stop abruptly at the edge of that perfect circle. They whined, paced, then sat, refusing to move forward. The handlers exchanged looks. Dogs didn't just refuse like that unless they sensed danger or nothing at all. Sheriff Givens ordered the river dragged for 3 days. Divers waded into its slow-moving current, their wetsuits dark against the pale water. They pulled up branches, silt the occasional lost fishing lure, but no bodies. The fields turned up nothing, no discarded clothing, no dropped possessions, no tire tracks in the dirt roads leading out of town. It was as if the Wrights had not walked away, but simply been erased. The more days passed, the stranger the details became. A milk delivery was found on the Wrights' front porch 2 days later. Untouched mail began piling in the box. The mechanic shop, where David worked, sat dark, tools exactly where had left them at the elementary school. Eleanor's desk still held a stack of graded papers, her pen resting neatly on top. Even Penny's collar was never recovered. By the end of the first week, the search shifted from rescue to recovery. That change in terminology hit the town hard. People who had been combing the woods daily began returning to work, to school, to whatever normal life was supposed to be. but for those closest to the Wrights, normal had fractured. Frank Allen and his wife, who had been the last to see them, found themselves replaying every moment of that evening. The way Jonah had stood at the fence, the flicker of the porch light, Eleanor's brief falter in expression. Each memory was dissected until it became less a recollection and more a wound. Rumors began to sprout like weeds in the absence of answers. Some said the Wrights had staged their disappearance, fled in the night to escape deaths or danger. Others whispered about cults, about strange symbols found carved into trees deep in the forest. A few spoke of the humming sound heard by the elderly neighbor, connecting it to the circle of flattened grass. UFO sightings had been reported in other counties that summer. After all, Sheriff Givens dismissed most of it, but late at night in his small office, he found himself staring at the aerial photographs taken of the Wright property. The circle in the grass was always there, stark and perfect, like an unanswered question burned into the earth. On the 10th day the case went cold. The Wright house was locked. The yard grew wild. For a while teenagers dared each other to break in, but even that stopped after one boy claimed he heard the sound of a door closing upstairs when he knew no one else was inside. The case file was moved from the sheriff's desk to a metal cabinet in the records room. Inside, the official paperwork ended with the same sentence repeated in different forms: no trace found, no leads established, family remains missing. In later years, when documentaries revisited the case, former officers admitted the Wright disappearance had left a mark on them. It wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the texture of the absence, how the family had seemed to dissolve without disturbing the world around them. One retired deputy put it plainly: I've worked drownings, I've worked homicides, I've worked kids running away from home. In every one of those you've got something: footprints, drag marks, a note, something. But this one, we had their dinner still on the table. That's not running away, that's not hiding, that's something else. By the end of the summer of 1977, Cedar Hollow had learned to stop talking about the Wrights. The name became a kind of ghost in conversation, a thing you didn't mention unless you wanted the air in the room to change. And yet behind closed doors the mystery never really left. People kept their own theories tucked away, ready to share with a trusted ear. Some swore the family had been taken underground, others believed they'd crossed into a place the rest of us can't see. Whatever happened that night in the Wright backyard, it had one undeniable quality: it didn't leave anything behind. When the official search wound down Cedar Hollow filled the silence in the only way it knew how, with stories they started small: a passing comment in the diner over coffee, a murmur exchanged at the post office. At first the talk was practical, where the Wrights might have gone, who might have seen something. But as the days turned to weeks and weeks into months, the conversations began to change shape. It wasn't about what happened anymore, it was about how strange it all was. And once people started talking about the strangeness, they couldn't stop. One of the first rumors to take root was about Jonah. People had noticed him the moment he arrived in town. How could they not? Cedar Hollow didn't get strangers unless they had a reason to be there. Eleanor called him an old friend, but no one could quite pin down from where. He never mentioned family, never talked about a job. In the weeks after the disappearance, the sheriff's office tried to track him through state records, driver's licenses, employment history, military service. They came back with nothing, not just no matches, nothing at all. It was as if Jonah had stepped into Cedar Hollow from nowhere, and when the Wrights vanished, had been pulled back to that same nowhere. Some said he was a drifter who got involved in something dangerous, and the Wrights had been caught in the crossfire. Others whispered he was running from something, and whatever it was had finally found him. And then there were the people who believed Jonah wasn't running from anything but towards something. That theory gained traction after a man named Willard Price, a quiet, sunburnt farmer on the edge of town, came forward with his own story. Willard claimed that on the night of the disappearance, had been walking his fence line just after sunset when he saw a shaft of light in the woods behind the Wright property. He said it wasn't lightning, there was no storm, it wasn't a flashlight either, it was too bright, too steady. He compared it to a spotlight, but one that didn't cast shadows. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, then it vanished. Willard kept it to himself for days, worried he'd sound crazy. But when he finally told his brother, the story traveled fast. Soon people were linking the shaft of light to the flattened circle of grass found in the woods. The talk turned from disappearances to abductions, not by people, but by something else entirely. Not everyone leaned toward the extraterrestrial. Some went in the opposite direction, deeper into the soil, into old ghost stories that had been passed down in Cedar Hollow long before the Wrights ever moved there. A few older residents remembered tales of a girl named Margaret Hollis who had drowned in the river in 1924. Her body was never recovered, and for decades afterward people claimed to see her in the woods on summer evenings, a pale figure standing just beyond the tree line, always watching. Most dismissed it as folklore meant to keep kids from wandering too far from home, but after the Wrights vanished, the story resurfaced. Some even said Margaret's ghost had been seen in the days leading up to the barbecue, a bad omen the town had ignored. There were other whispers, two stranger ones. A teenager swore had been out in the fields that night and heard a humming sound, low and constant, that seemed to come from everywhere. A woman said she'd found her kitchen clock running backward for 3 hours straight. A retired railroad worker claimed had been walking home past the Wright property the night before the disappearance and saw 3 people standing perfectly still in the backyard, none of whom moved. When he called out, none of these claims were verified, but that hardly mattered. The thing about small towns is that once a story takes root, it doesn't need proof, it only needs repetition. And in Cedar Hollow, the Wright case became a seed that sprouted 100 strange blooms. By the end of the year, theories had split into camps. The practical camp believed the Wrights had been victims of a crime, a home invasion gone wrong, a kidnapping. They argued the lack of evidence was due to careful planning, maybe even law enforcement incompetence. The paranoid camp insisted something bigger was at play, government experiments, hidden tunnels beneath the town, strange aircraft sighted over the river valley. They pointed to Jonah's lack of records as proof that he wasn't who he claimed to be. The supernatural camp believed the Wrights had been taken by something not entirely human, whether ghost spirits or something from the stars. To them, the circle in the grass was the smoking gun. The sheriff's office tried to keep a lid on the rumors, but it was impossible. The case had already slipped from their hands into the realm of local myth. In that realm, the Wrights weren't just a missing family. They were symbols of safety lost, of questions unanswered, of the way the world can tilt on its axis in a single ordinary evening. One detail, however, never made it into the official public narrative. About a year after the disappearance, the county clerk went to pull the Wright file for a request from a crime magazine. While going through the records, she noticed something odd. Jonah's name wasn't in any of the original reports anymore. It had been there before. She remembered typing it herself in the witness statements, but now the typed pages had blank spaces where his name should have been, not crossed out, not blacked out, just gone. When she asked Sheriff Givens about it, he told her to stop digging. Within weeks, she resigned and moved to another county. By the time the 70s gave way to the 80s, Cedar Hollow had learned to keep its theories quiet. People still spoke about the Wrights, but only in certain company late at night, when the air was still and the lights were low. The case faded from headlines, replaced by newer stories, newer tragedies. But under the surface it remained like a current beneath calm water, and as the decades passed, the only constant was the same question that had started it all. Where did they go? Time is a strange thing in small towns. It doesn't heal wounds, it just covers them with dust. After the summer of 1977, Cedar Hollow slipped into a long, restless silence. The Wright family became a shadow in the town's collective memory, a ghost story whispered in half-lit kitchens and at the edges of playgrounds. The Wright house stood frozen in time. Neighbors watched as the lawn grew wild, paint peeled from the porch, and the curtains fluttered in empty windows. The air inside held the faintest scent of lemon pie and charred burgers, the remnants of that last barbecue. The town tried to move on, but the absence was impossible to ignore. Each July, when the cicadas returned, some old-timers claimed they could hear faint laughter floating on the breeze. Children dared each other to approach the fence, but no one dared cross it. Over the years, stories surfaced of sightings: a man seen walking along a distant highway, a girl glimpsed in a mall security camera far from Cedar Hollow. None of these led anywhere concrete. Jonah was never seen again after the disappearance. The empty guest room above the garage gathered dust. The neighbors said he had vanished as mysteriously as the Wrights. Some speculated he had left town the next morning, but there was no record of it, no trail, no forwarding address. His name became a question mark, a loose thread in the tapestry of the case that no one could follow. As the years turned into decades, the Wright disappearance faded from public view. Law enforcement files collected dust. New deputies took over. New mysteries came and went, but for the few who remembered, the story lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. In the 1990s, an amateur documentary crew visited Cedar Hollow seeking to capture the town's history. They interviewed residents, piecing together fragments of memory. One elderly woman recounted the tale of the barbecue, her voice trembling as she described the day the family vanished. The footage showed the dilapidated Wright house, now almost swallowed by Ivy and Shadow, the crew filmed the woods, the circle, and the grass long since grown over. The documentary aired locally, stirring old fears and fresh curiosity, but it offered no answers, only questions dressed in nostalgia. The 2000s brought the internet, a new kind of echo chamber for unsolved mysteries. Online forums buzzed with speculation. The right case joined the ranks of other strange disappearances shared and reshared by armchair detectives hungry for puzzles. Photos of the last barbecue, grainy and black and white, circulated with captions full of wonder and fear. Jonah's name appeared again, this time with theories ranging from cult member to government agent to alien abductee. Despite the attention, no one found new evidence. Law enforcement remained silent. Official statements were sparse, careful not to reopen wounds. To most, the Wright family had become a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the world holds mysteries it refuses to explain. Yet the silence was not empty, it was waiting for Jonah to return. The unexpected appearance of Jonah in 2025 walking into a Montana police station decades after disappearing without a trace shattered that silence. It was a moment that no one in Cedar Hollow had dared imagine. A man thought lost to time, suddenly willing to speak. The man who had been there the night the barbecue ended. The man who had vanished into the same void. The weight of those decades without him would make his story all the more haunting, because sometimes the longest silences are the loudest echoes of all. It was a quiet afternoon in Montana when a man walked into the police station in the small town of Plains. He was unremarkable at first glance, an elderly figure hunched beneath a weathered coat, his hair silvered by time and his eyes clouded, but alert. His hands trembled slightly as he approached the front desk. "I need to speak to someone," he said, voice cracked but steady. The officer on duty looked up, puzzled. "About what, sir?" "My name is Jonah," the man said simply. "Jonah Davis. I was involved in something that happened a long time ago. You might know it as the Wright family disappearance." A silence fell. The Wright family, that name had haunted cold cases for nearly half a century. News traveled quickly. The man who was long thought missing, possibly dead, the last person to be seen with the Wright family the day they vanished, had come forward. The town of Cedar Hollow was stunned. The mystery, dormant for decades, suddenly had a living voice. Jonah was taken to a private room in the station, away from the curious eyes of reporters and onlookers. His eyes flicked nervously around the room, avoiding direct contact, yet there was an undeniable gravity to his presence, the weight of a story carried for nearly 50 years, waiting for release. He spoke slowly, at first as though each word was dredged from a deep, "Well, I want to tell you what happened," he said. "Everything, but I need you to understand it's not a story like you've heard before." The officer nodded. The recorder was turned on. Jonah's voice was fragile but determined. He described the barbecue in the Wright backyard with a precision that surprised everyone. The same details that neighbors remembered: the laughter, the sun, the grill's smoke came alive again through his words. But as he spoke, his tone shifted. The lightness gave way to something darker, more unsettling. He told of Eleanor's unease in the days before the barbecue. She had confided in him about threats, vague but real, something lurking in the shadows of their lives. He mentioned a figurehead seen in the woods that evening, a silhouette moving just beyond the fence line. He said he heard an unearthly humming sound that no one else seemed to notice. Then came the moment that froze the room, when everything changed. "I didn't disappear with them," Jonah whispered. "I woke up somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't Cedar Hollow, somewhere I couldn't explain." His hands shook as he recounted being trapped in a place with no doors, no windows, only endless sterile walls. He said the Wright family was there with him, but they were separated, taken one by one. He didn't say who took them, only that it was something beyond human understanding. The officers listened in stunned silence, caught between skepticism and a deep primal urge to believe. Jonah's story was not just a confession, it was a plea, a desperate attempt to bridge a silence that had lasted nearly 50 years. As he finished, Jonah looked up with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 lost moments. "Please," he said, "help me find them, help me find the truth." The room seemed to hold its breath. Jonah's return wasn't just a new lead, it was a resurrection of the past, a reopening of wounds thought sealed. For Cedar Hollow, for the Wright family, and for everyone who had waited decades for answers, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Jonah's eyes, once bright with life, now carried the weight of decades spent in silence and fear. As he began recounting that summer evening, his voice wavered not from age, but from the raw memory of what had transpired. He spoke slowly, each word seeming to carve itself out of a fog he had lived inside for nearly 50 years. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He said the barbecue was supposed to be normal, a simple gathering, but Eleanor, she was scared. She told me she'd been getting threats, but she didn't say from whom, just that something was coming, something. She couldn't stop. Jonah described Eleanor's hands trembling as she sliced the lemon pie, her eyes flickering toward the woods like she expected to see shadows moving there. He remembered the figure, a dark silhouette standing just beyond the fence line, not a neighbor, not someone they knew. The whole evening felt off. The air was thick like before a storm, but the sky was clear. Then came the humming, a low, constant sound that no one else seemed to hear, like electricity running through the ground beneath their feet. It started faint, but grew louder, almost drowning out the laughter and chatter. Jonah said he tried to tell David, but the words caught in his throat. The family's smiles never faltered, but the tension was there like a thread stretched tight, ready to snap. Then everything shifted. Jonah recalled the sudden flicker of the porch light. It wasn't a normal flicker, it pulsed like a heartbeat, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard. The children stopped playing. Penny growled low in her throat, staring toward the tree line. Eleanor stood, her voice barely a whisper, as she said, "It's time." And then darkness. When Jonah woke up, he said it was somewhere else entirely. He described sterile white walls that stretched endlessly, no windows, no doors, a place that felt alive, breathing, but without a single sign of humanity. He wasn't alone. The Wright family was there too, but they were separated from him. He heard their voices, sometimes calls for help, whispers of fear, but he never saw them. Days and weeks blurred together, time lost meaning. Jonah spoke of shadows moving just beyond his sight, of cold corridors where the humming never stopped. It was like being trapped inside a nightmare you can't wake up from. He said his story was not just one of horror, but of isolation, alone. Jonah said he searched for a way out, every step heavy with exhaustion and dread. He tried to hold on to memories of the Wrights, but even those began to fade. The man who once stood silently by the fence was now a ghost in his own story, forgotten, lost between moments that stretched and snapped like broken glass. As the interview room fell quiet, it was clear Jonah's tale was only beginning. Behind his words lay a puzzle, fragments of a reality that refused to align with the world outside. And as the truth started to seep out, it promised to be more terrifying than anyone had imagined. Jonah's eyes darkened as he spoke of the place he called the other side, a realm that defied logic and stretched the limits of human endurance. He described the walls, endless and sterile, a blinding white that seemed to pulse with a cold, indifferent light. No windows, no doors, no escape. The silence was thick, oppressive, broken only by that unrelenting humming that had followed him from the backyard into this strange prison. The air had no scent, no warmth. It was as if life itself had been stripped away, leaving only a vast empty shell. The Wright family was there with him, but fragmented, torn apart. Jonah recalled hearing Eleanor's soft calls from a distant corridor, the children's frightened whispers echoing faintly, and David's firm voice trying to soothe the terror. None of them could escape, but he never saw them. They were shadows behind walls he could not pass through, voices trapped in the same maze of white light and humming sound each time a family member was taken. Jonah said the silence grew heavier, the walls seeming to close in. Further days or weeks passed. Time had no meaning. Jonah's mind became a battleground between hope and despair. He wandered the corridors endlessly, sometimes speaking aloud to the empty space, his voice swallowed by the humming. He described moments when the walls themselves seemed to breathe, when the light would flicker and pulse like a heartbeat, and when cold fingers of fear wrapped around his soul. Despite the loneliness, Jonah never gave up searching. He followed the humming, hoping it was a guide, a thread to follow back to the world had lost. But each turn only led deeper into the labyrinth. The presence that took the Wright family remained unseen, a force felt, but never glimpsed. Jonah called it the Watcher, an entity that observed, but never spoke, a cold intelligence that seemed to toy with him. He felt eyes on his back, constantly heard whispers in the hum, and sensed the walls shifting to block his path whenever he drew near to the others. Eventually a door appeared, not a real door, but a shimmering veil of light, a threshold that pulsed with energy and beckoned him to cross. Jonah said he hesitated, knowing that stepping through might mean leaving everything behind, but desperation won. He slipped through and found himself alone in a vast empty field under a starless sky. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing beneath in endless blackness. Jonah woke up the next day disoriented on the side of a highway miles from Cedar Hollow. He was Alone, the Wright family was gone. He never learned what had happened to them after that. The room was silent as Jonah finished his story. His voice was raw, but resolute, a man who had carried the unbearable burden of the unknown and had finally spoken it aloud. For those listening, the mystery deepened and darkened. The thin line between reality and nightmare blurred. Jonah's unexpected reappearance sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet borders of Cedar Hollow. What had been a cold case frozen in time suddenly stirred back to life, attracting the attention of modern investigators equipped with new technologies and fresh perspectives. Detective Laura Mitchell, a seasoned cold case specialist, was assigned to lead the reopened investigation. She approached the case with a mixture of professional skepticism and quiet determination. To her, Jonah's story was both a breakthrough and a challenge, a narrative so surreal it strained belief, yet anchored by details only someone truly involved could know. The first step was verification. DNA tests confirmed Jonah's identity beyond doubt. His fingerprints matched records from 1977, and despite decades spent off the grid, the science proved he was who he claimed to be. Investigators cross-checked his memories with existing police files and witness statements. Many details matched: the flickering porch light, the circle of flattened grass, the reported humming sound. Forensic artists were brought in to visualize Jonah's descriptions of the strange doorless facility where he was held. Surprisingly, their sketches bore resemblance to decommissioned Cold War-era government test sites located within a few hundred miles of Cedar Hollow. Though no direct evidence linked these sites to the disappearance, the connection sparked new lines of inquiry. At the same time, audio experts analyzed old recordings from local news broadcasts and emergency calls from that summer evening. They detected faint low-frequency hums embedded beneath the static sounds that had gone unnoticed at the time. Could they have been related to whatever Jonah experienced? Skeptics pushed back hard. Many experts argued Jonah's story was a psychological manifestation, a trauma-induced fantasy born from decades of silence and guilt. Others suspected elaborate fabrication or delusion. Detective Mitchell acknowledged these doubts, but remained open. Our job isn't to believe or disbelieve, she said, it's to find the truth. Meanwhile, the Wright property had become a focal point for the investigation. Once more, teams surveyed the land with ground-penetrating radar and drone imaging, searching for hidden tunnels or anomalies beneath the earth. So far, nothing definitive had surfaced. The town of Cedar Hollow watched all this unfold with mixed emotions. For some, Jonah's return was a chance at healing, a way to finally confront the past. For others, it reopened old wounds best left closed. As the investigation pressed on, new questions emerged, pulling the mystery deeper into shadow. If Jonah was telling the truth, what was the nature of the watcher he described? Who or what was behind the disappearance? And could the Wright family still be found? The answers, Detective Mitchell knew, would require confronting truths stranger than fiction, truths that challenged the very fabric of reality. Jonah's return did more than reopen a case. It reopened old wounds in Cedar Hollow. The news spread like wildfire, stirring memories long buried and emotions carefully locked away. For many, Jonah was a ghost come back from the past, a reminder of a tragedy they tried to forget. The town's residents reacted in waves, some welcoming, some wary, and some openly hostile. At the local diner, conversations turned tense as people debated whether Jonah was a victim or a liar. After all these years, why now? One woman asked bitterly, why come back and stir up pain? Others saw him as a survivor, someone who finally found the courage to speak. He's the only one who might know what happened. A young teacher said quietly, we owe him that much. Families divided along old lines. The reemergence of the mystery, exposing fractures in relationships long thought healed. Some blamed Jonah for the disappearance, accusing him of betrayal, or worse, others defended him fiercely. The Wright property, once a forgotten ruin, became a pilgrimage site for amateur sleuths, paranormal enthusiasts, and grieving strangers seeking closure. Local officials struggled to manage the renewed attention. Town meetings grew heated as residents debated whether to preserve the property or let nature reclaim it fully. Police found themselves caught between respecting the family's privacy and responding to a flood of curiosity and conspiracy theories. Amid the turmoil, Eleanor's closest childhood friend spoke publicly for the first time. She described Eleanor as a woman of quiet strength who had feared something dark, was approaching a feeling she never shook. Her words resonated deeply, reminding Cedar Hollow of the human lives behind the headlines, the community's collective heartbeat, quickened part fear, part hope. Cedar Hollow was no longer just a backdrop for a mystery. It was a character itself, haunted by its past and wrestling with an uncertain future. In the silence between whispers and speculation, one truth stood clear: some mysteries never truly, and they linger, shaping the lives of everyone they touch, echoing through time like a distant, relentless song. The day Jonah returned to Cedar Hollow was heavy with anticipation, a quiet storm of memory and emotion gathering just beneath the surface. He arrived at the right property as dusk bled into the sky, painting the clouds in shades of purple and ash. The air was thick with cicadas, their steady drone filling the silence like a heartbeat. The yard was overgrown now, wild grass brushing against rusted remnants of the grill, weeds curling around the cracked picnic table where decades earlier laughter had once spilled freely. Jonah moved slowly, his footsteps soft on the untamed earth. His eyes traced the outlines of the old fence, the edge of the woods, the place where the balloon had once danced in the summer breeze. He stopped at the spot where the last photograph had been taken, the one that had frozen a moment just before everything changed. This is where the door was. Jonah whispered, voice barely audible over the hum of evening insects. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cracked, sun-baked ground as if feeling for a threshold invisible to anyone else. The wind stirred the grass, bending it in waves. Somewhere deep in the woods, a branch snapped. Jonah's eyes flickered, searching the shadows behind him. The world held its breath. No answers came, no doors opened, no voices called, only the quiet, endless pulse of the night. And yet in that silence, something lingered, a presence not seen, but felt, the weight of all the moments lost, the echo of footsteps that never returned. Jonah stood alone, carrying the burden of a story no one else could fully understand. As the stars emerged one by one, the camera lingered on his face, weathered, haunted, yet resolute. He had come back, not just to tell what happened, but to face the place where it began, to confront a mystery that, like the night itself, held both darkness and possibility. The final words came softly: some doors once opened never truly closed. The screen fades to black. The mystery remains alive, unresolved, a story still reaching through time.